Let me start the video here.
What's up, man?
Hey, how you doing?
I was saying in honor of Halloween, uh, it would be awesome to have the great Tim Seeley
All
speak to the
right.
yeah. So
I'm
people
on,
are
I'm on strike, so this is a perfect time to get me.
yeah, and then some of the posters of your art and stuff behind you. It's Halloweenish. Yeah, I'm in costume right now. I'm Tim Seeley. That's my costume. I don't know,
You look
dude.
like you look more like a lumberjack than me.
All right, I just changed my costume. I'm now a lumberjack. And so how's it going? How are you, sir?
Good, good to see you.
Um, Yeah, you too, man. Gotta hang out like in person and uh all that good stuff soon. Are you doing anything with the little one for Halloween?
Right now, she's in a parade in the snow at
Yeah.
her school. Tonight, the plan is to trick or treat in the snow. But she doesn't care. She's excited either way. She doesn't. This doesn't affect kids. They're good to go.
Yeah. Us too. We're gonna try to scoop up as many kids as we can and try to bother the neighbors for candy. I guess we can get started. It's 10:01. There's roughly 15 in this class, and then I invited my two other classes to kind of attend. Um, So thanks for last minute agreeing to talk to my class, Tim. So kind of the agenda is sort of like I'm just going to ask you questions about what college was like, how you got your first gig, and then a little bit about Hackslash. I can kind of share a screen and find some. I don't know if you have any images of anything from Hackslash. I want to talk a little bit about the Chucky story in honor of Halloween, how you did that, which was really amazing how you got him to be in your comic. And then maybe even like what is Hackslash? So that's really just the agenda. Now this class is made up of some freshmen and seniors and like across the board. Some of them are just starting off their education. We have one student who wants to be an animator. We have a bunch of film students, a bunch of marketing people. So just like kind of keeping that in mind as we go through, that's what's going to direct my questions.
Sure. I mean, that's kind of when you're a comic creator, all those are your job, which is
Yeah.
marketing person, manager, artist, writer. You get to do all of those jobs for one cheap price.
Yeah. Um, So I guess where did you go to college? What did you study? What did you want to do back then? So like going back in time.
I mean, my goal was always to be a comic creator. When I was a kid, I grew up in rural Wisconsin. There wasn't a lot to do. I just had my brothers. I had two brothers. They're younger than me, and so my parents early on sort of figured out that they could take us to town, give us $10, and we could find entertainment by sitting in the grocery store aisle with the racks of comics. And then they could just drop us off at home, and we'd be in the woods with nothing to do except we would have comics and we would make stories and stuff together. So I didn't really have any other goals ever. I was just my plan from like 10 years old on was to do comics. So I have lots of embarrassing submissions that I sent to Marvel Comics when I was 11. So I was always trying to do this. I think it was the one goal I ever had. But I ended up when I was self-publishing stuff when I was a kid, like 17, 18. I was self-publishing comics, terrible comics, but comics nonetheless. And that led me to comic conventions, at which I started meeting all these other people that also wanted to do comics. And so we would team up on projects. And as early as like 17, 18, I was going to comic conventions with a self-published, terrible, but self-published comic. And so that kind of led me to what I wanted to do in college. I knew to focus on illustration, and I knew to try to get an internship at one of the major publishers. So that's kind of how I navigated the process to use college to be useful for me in later life.
When you walked around the comic convention, with your self-published comic, you were mentioned being 17 or 18. Did you show it to any bigwigs and try to get them to?
Oh, I mean, everyone. I would give it to everybody. And this was kind of before the internet was very prevalent as a publishing platform, and it was also way before the internet was a useful place to put portfolios. So this was the only way. I mean, in 1994, 1995, the image bandwidth was too low for this to be a thing. So so this was the way to do it. And so, I lived in central Wisconsin. I could drive down to Chicago, go to the Wizard World Chicago, which was the name of the show then. My buddies and I would save up our summer job money and get a booth for $80 or something, and stay at a hotel, and then just do exactly what you're saying. We would go around and give it to anybody that we could talk to, because the goal was just to get seen, and before the internet and having that as a platform, this was the best way. I mean, I would leave my comics in bathrooms. I would leave them, just to get people to see it, and you know it was the cheapest way to do it, was just to print something. It would still cost me. I remember it like wiped me out to spend $350 to publish like 200 some comics or something, but it worked. I mean, I met tons of people that way.
Did anyone remember you later on as that kid who was like, "Hey, I remember you from the Comic Con when you actually because your first gig was at Marvel, right?"
Well, I mean, then I interned at Marvel when I was 21, and then that was an intern job, so it was it wasn't a lot of actually making comics. It was sort of behind the scene. It was an editorial internship, which was great because I saw a lot of the how the sausage gets made, and it was very useful and educational. But yeah, my jobs came after that college, but yeah, there were people that I would be like, "Oh, I remember you. You gave me this weird comic," and some of those people are still my friends. It's crazy that the business is kind of small enough, and Chicago itself is small enough that a lot of those people. Actually, I saw one of the guys I gave one of my first comics to this weekend when I went to uh, a Halloween themed flea market. He was there, still selling comics, still doing living the dream. So yeah, lots of people, and that means it was impactful. That means it worked to some degree. And my $200 investment was or $300 investment was well spent.
What what college did you go to, and what were the illustration courses and gen ed, and like did that help shape you in any way? What was important from college that helped you, you know, conceptualize your comic stuff? Like, is there any good experiences from that? And then what was the name of your college?
Actually went so the first 2 years, I was broke. So the first 2 years I went to a community college in Wausau, Wisconsin called University of Wisconsin Marathon County. It was an extension of Madison. So we had the same curriculum sort of as Madison, and you could direct transfer to UW Madison. Uh, but my girlfriend went to UW Eau Claire, so I followed her to Eau Claire, which was also a Wisconsin school. But they had a pretty good, they were actually known for their illustration program. I thought college was extremely useful for me. My first 2 years, the college I went to, I had design classes and I had sculpture classes, and there were arts that I didn't have any experience with, nor at the time really that much interest in. But uh, you know, having a wide base of creative abilities and a sense of history helps you in every other creative uh, aspect that you work on. So, I'm always stunned how much use I got out of sculpture class, which I wouldn't think would do anything really for me. But sort of a big part of the class was materials and understanding the history of public art and all that sort of stuff. Art history was extremely useful for me. I think the even some of the stuff I took, like a history of Native American art. I took a history of modern art, all that sort of stuff. All of it was useful. I think the influences that you wouldn't have found without college are just, it's such a wide area of things that you wouldn't see without going to college and spending that time doing it. I don't think most of us are individually motivated enough to teach ourselves the history of art, or to take on, like, I took tons of graphic design classes, and that's where I learned to use, and this is like 1996, so I learned to use Photoshop and I learned to use Illustrator. And I don't think any of those would have been interesting to me without those classes. I mean, they were, Illustrator 2 and Photoshop 1, and they were slow and not nearly as good as they are now. But without those classes, I don't think I'd be as skilled in those programs as I am now.
I have a certain fondness. I went to Marine Valley Community College for 2 years. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It's like in Palos Heights or something. And like My fondest memories are actually of community college, like having a beat up old computer, doing something, waiting for the command to wait 5 minutes. There's something, I don't
Yeah.
know, nostalgic and really beautiful about, I don't know, that time period and the process of making art. Like sometimes when you're forced to work under limited constraints, you make the best work, I feel like, you
I mean,
know.
I absolutely agree with you. My community college had this art building, which was basically a tool shed, and it was like in the edge of a parking lot next to a train line, and there's nothing about it that should have worked. But I to this day, I think I made some of my best stuff. At like 2 in the morning in this crappy building, surrounded by, you know, visible insulation and all the art projects of years past laying about, and and a lot of it was just learning to work with people, which I think, my community college, we'd have like group sculpture projects or whatever, and I think that's a big part of anything creative going forward is the ability to work with other people, because most creative endeavors are at least somewhat collaborative. Whether it's in comics working with writers and artists, or working in graphic design, working with art directors, it's almost always collaborative. So I think those skills were super useful.
Um, I want to fast forward a little bit. So you were learning all this cool stuff. You had a comic at 18, 19. You were trying to fish around. How did you land your, was the Marvel the first gig? The internship? Was that your first thing, or how did
Yeah,
that happen?
yeah, that was definitely the first one. My college gave credits for summer internships, and so I looked around. I had applied at a whole bunch of them, and it was kind of determined like which field I would go into. I applied at Robert De Niro's film company at the time, and an independent publisher in Seattle, and Marvel, and I'd gotten the other two, so I was like deciding which one to do, and I'm like, oh, I guess I didn't get the Marvel one. But very last second, like the week before I would have to leave, they called me and said, "Hey, you want to do this internship?" And so I had to scramble all my plans and get to New York City and get somewhere to live. I was 21. I didn't really know. I was from a small town, like going straight from a town of like, 1,800 people to New York City. But it was great. I mean, and I think Marvel at the time was going through bankruptcy, which I think is probably crazy for people to hear now, because you think of Marvel as the most profitable entertainment company on earth. But at the time, and it was not because of comics, it was because of tons of bad investments and people stealing from them, that they were going through bankruptcy. And so it was actually a great time to work there, because I got to see everything that can go wrong and all the things that, I mean, one of my jobs was to call freelance artists and tell them that we had to sue them to get the paychecks back because we were in bankruptcy protection. And just things that a 21-year-old with these big dreams of working in comics should would not want to do. But in the end, I actually found it probably the most useful, because it set me up for, this is how hard it is to work in entertainment, and this is how conflicting it can be to do business and to do commerce and art at the same time. So it was kind of great. It was pretty useful. I met a lot of great interns there, a lot of creatives, and I definitely recommend internships as a really great thing to do in college, because you get credit for it, but it puts you in a position that that will be very similar to the rest of your working life.
Um, I mean, that's extremely true. Like, I'm sort of pushing them to do the same, and I always do this thing where I'm always like, be selfish, be selfish. If you know a faculty member who's working on a cool project, or even with me, and there's something I'm doing, like, don't let this opportunity to pass you up. Where
Yeah,
did you where did you go? Where did you go from there? Like, how did you land your first full-time gig after your internship?
yeah. So I came out of Marvel, then I graduated that semester, and I it was like everybody. I think you get out of college, I wasn't sure what to do, and so I went to a comic convention. I got a job at a comic book company, but it was very small and it paid very poorly. So I needed something else, but I was doing what I said I was going to do. So I was like, I'm going to do comics, and I was, and so I was in Minneapolis at the time, and then I got a another internship because of my Marvel internship at a book publisher, and they were a children's book company. And it actually worked out great, because they had staff illustrators, which is very uncommon for companies to have staff illustrators, but they did a lot of educational books. And the person who was working there, she was an amazing illustrator, but she was completely old school. physical, non-digital work, and they were transitioning to try. This is like 1999, 2000, and they were transitioning to do more digital stuff. And I had just come out with, I know how to use Photoshop, I know how to use Illustrator, I know how to scan stuff, and I know how to change levels to get things to printable stuff. And they still had old school stuff like Ruby Lift, and they had a job position called a stripper, which wasn't the kind of stripper you're familiar with. It was the person who cuts Ruby Lift and does all this stuff. So I ended up as an intern for about 3 months, and then they needed me because I had digital skills, and at the time that was fairly rare. So I became a full-time staff illustrator at the children's book company, and did comics on the side. And I always joke about it because I was doing kids books during the day, and then most of the comics I were doing were adult comics. So I would spend my time in the world of children, and during the day I go home and spend my time in the world of adults at night.
Um, now you this is like building your art skills too, right? Not just your technical know-how, but like this is like really pushing the stuff you learned in college to a new level. I'm assuming, like working at these studios as an artist and a writer, right?
Yeah, because well, at the book company, the sort of the best part about it was is that it was an educational book company, so they had storybooks, so you're doing narrative stuff. But I was also having to do just graphs and illustrations, technical illustrations, stuff. It was just a wide array of stuff. So I remember one time I had to that we had a science book, and it was like how to dissect a chicken. You go to the grocery store, you buy a chicken and take it apart, and I had to take apart a chicken over the course of like 4 days and illustrate all the parts of it, and then and then the next day I was doing a map of like of food across Europe and all this sort of stuff. So it was extremely useful in that it gave me this huge base. But then I would also, work on some of the narrative books, and so I was reading scripts, and I was seeing stuff, how you connect stylistically a script with an artist, and all kinds of stuff that would go on to be extremely useful later. So, I always feel like there's a all the jobs you have in art, just always take them when they come because you'll learn something from them. And you may just learn you don't want to draw maps. I mean, that was partially something I learned that I was like not super into it. Or I would do graphic design, and I'm not a great graphic designer and never have been and never will be. But I learned how to use programs for laying out design, Quark, and all this stuff. So all that stuff built up to give me a base of knowledge which I could use to start self-publishing, which is what I did immediately after that job. And I knew how to deal with printers. And I knew all this stuff from Marvel, and I learned a bunch of stuff from the book company. So I was well placed to know how to do that kind of thing and do a better job than I had in high school, where I used like a printer, little Kinko's essentially, which is not even around anymore. And was able to use those skills to make something a better portfolio piece to shop around to publishers.
When you say self-published, are you talking about Hackslash? Like, is that your
Well,
first
that
big
came a little
comic?
bit later, but yeah, no, it came a little later. I worked. I eventually started. I moved to Chicago. I started working at Devil's Due, which was a company here in Chicago that just started. They got the rights to GI Joe, which is a big toy line, and the guy Josh needed somebody who knew how to do, work with printers, knew how to, do editorial, set up schedules, and I had done all that stuff. So I moved to Chicago and started working there. And that I was drawing it. I was either doing editorial or I was drawing, and I kind of came up with Hack Slash out of frustration of working with a toy company because they would have these crazy rules of things you couldn't draw, and it's a military thing, and they'd be like you can't point guns at people and all this weird stuff. So Hack Slash was in part like me going, I got to do something to sort of ease the stress of this company. So uh, that's when I pitched the idea of doing my own book at Devil's Due, and essentially sort of ran the show with the publisher. And I wrote that one, at first. And the original writer was actually going to be Robert Kirkman, who went on to make The Walking Dead. And he was a guy I knew at the time. And he was going to write it. And then he said, I got all this other stuff. You can write it. You're good, but do it by yourself. And I thought, okay. So I wrote it myself. But otherwise, it would have been I'd probably be a millionaire if Robert had, I could get Robert to do it. But then I'd co own it with Robert instead of, with Stefano.
Yeah, now he's the famous of the famous. Like you hear him everywhere. Um, so the idea though for it just kind of came up on us. Do you happen to have a copy anywhere around you? You could just flash the cover
I can
or
share. I can share. I'll share
okay.
the screen because you mentioned the Chucky one. I can do the. There we go. That's the. So this was the book. We eventually did this crossover with Chucky in there, but that's some of the digital stuff. I mean, I've got books all. You can see probably some of the art behind me is Hack Slash stuff as well. But yeah, that's the comic. Let's see.
What is it about? Like, can you give them a little background on what
Yeah,
Hackslash is? And then we'll get into from its inception, where it took you, and then the optioning stuff and all that other good stuff. So like, where did the idea come from and what is it?
yeah. So, so the idea came from, I want to do something of my own. I had kind of a list of all the things I wasn't allowed to do on GI Joe, and I decided I'd do a comic that had all the things that I couldn't do. So it was like, it couldn't be sexy, it couldn't have knives, and it could have all this stuff. I was like, I'm gonna do all those things. So, but then it was actually, I think this is like 21 years ago to today, I guess. It was Halloween Day. I was supposed to go out and do something, but I was sick. I had a flu or a cold or something, and I was just miserable. And all my roommates were out. I'm like, 24 years old. All my roommates were out for the night, and I watched AMC had this like marathon of all these slasher movies. So I started watching them all, and I'm taking cold medicine, and I don't know if I was just kind of high and out of it, but I was like, these all take place in the same universe, like Haddonfield is next to Springfield. I don't know, some big idea. And so I put it all together. It's like, that's it. That's the story I can do with all these, other characters and all these ideas that I couldn't do. I can make it sexy, I can make it violent, I can make it trashy, all these sort of things. And originally, I kind of thought about making it sort of more of a comedy, but it kind of became somewhere in the middle. And I pitched it to the publisher like the next week. He's like, "Yep, go ahead, you can do it. Here's your budget. You got to run it kind of yourself." And so I put together a script. And originally, like I said, I put together a pitch. I was going to have Robert write it. He became busy. He's like, "All right, I'll write it myself." So I spent a bunch of time, working out what the story would be, and I really kind of wrote my first script. I hadn't really written a full script before, and I met an artist from Italy named Stefano Caselli while working on some other books. And I called him and I said, "You're Italian. You must love horror." And he was like, "Bro, I love horror." And so we teamed up, and we've been co-creators on it for 20 years. And we put the book out, and it was successful. I mean, not huge, but it was successful enough to keep going, and that kind of allowed us to, you know, of the books that were launched that year, I think ours was the most successful, and so it was never at the time it was like never enough to like make us rich, but it paid for itself. It paid for the next one, and so we just kept going. And the third book, third book is the Chucky one, which we just we could just keep having crazy ideas and come up with new like let's call the people who make Chucky and see if we can do a crossover and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's interesting that like you literally called the creator of Chucky or you emailed it. Like, how did that happen? Where you actually got him to say okay to let you use Chucky for the comic?
So we had done some Chucky stuff earlier because we had a deal with Universal Film, and so I found out that Don Mancini, the guy who created Chucky, was here in Chicago. He's from Chicago and still lived around here. So I just asked theater people, actors, until I got his contact information, and I had emailed him. And he was kind of like, "Yeah, whatever, kid, do whatever you want." But we had the rights to it, and so the nice thing about a lot of horror stuff is that most of them are they're connected to their creator. Uh, you know, Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees, because they're so low budget, they're owned by people, not corporations generally. So it's actually surprisingly easy to find these horror stories and work with people because they're owned by human beings. I mean, Chucky's partially owned by Universal, but I mean, Don Mancini's still writing Chucky. He writes the TV show that's on right now on Sci-Fi Network. He writes the whole thing.
Speaking of TV shows, I know you were on Sci-Fi. Actually, you did like an illustration for them of Dick Grayson, right? From the Dick series or from the
Yeah.
Grayson series that you had done. How did Sci-Fi contact you? And then I guess the second question is, we talked a little bit about this before, like this concept of optioning and Amazon Prime and all this other stuff. So I guess how did you get on Sci-Fi Channel and how did that go about? And this maybe that could lead into more about the business aspect of like what is optioning if you have an idea and all that.
Yeah, I mean, so Sci-Fi Channel has had for a long time. They have like a platform, where they're supposed to be into all nerd stuff. So they've always kind of done stuff with comics to some degree. I mean, obviously they focus on a TV show, but so they send out a guy with a camera, and they go to various towns. They've been to New York, they've been to Portland, they've been to Chicago and LA, and then they just sit down and they interview comic creators and have you do like a little interview plus drawing. And so they ran those spots on the network. Uh, there was a couple of sort of things like that. There was Spike TV did a thing called the Scream Awards, which was like a horror awards, and they did a comics thing. So I got to go to LA and go to the Scream Awards, and George Lucas was there and Marilyn Manson and all this stuff. So the thing with comics is, though it's pretty small, relatively speaking, it's got a pretty rabid fan base, and you know, that can help these companies connect to their fans. So, I'm sure no one got rich out of having us there, but it helps them in their big plans, and then that helps promote myself. So always happy to do it. I'll show up on any damn TV show. I mean, I did there was a Hack Slash mention in the Scream TV show and all this stuff. Like whatever you can get, you just you take it because it's like helps you get to more people.
And then so you put it out there, it's successful. There's Hack Slash toys too, right? Like or figurines
Yeah, I
or
mean, we've done all kinds of licensed stuff. I mean, and because I own it, people have to come to me if they want to do something. So, we have action figures. I have one hanging right back there actually. We've done all the little things that we can to, and for me, something isn't real until it has an action figure. So now that we've got action figures, I guess I could technically retire. I could just be like, "Yep, I'm out. I did it." But it's just the fan bases for this kind of stuff are kind of similar. So, people who read manga like action figures and like comics and like sci-fi movies and horror movies, and so it's a small little world, but making merch and making that kind of stuff is so much part of the job. Because I go to conventions and I bring a big stack of books and I bring some action figures and I bring T-shirts and all that kind of stuff.
there's people in this class. We did a whole thing on script writing, and there are people in this class who are interested in narrative. And like what do you have any advice on writing or getting into writing or how to write something or like just I'm not really a narrative designer and or narratologist or whatever, but we talked a little bit about that. Like any advice just on because I know you've actually written video games too. Like you wrote Injustice or something, didn't you write
I wrote
something for?
Mortal Kombat Onslaught, which just came out, I believe. I co-wrote that with the NetherRealm narrative designer Dominic Ciancialo. So yeah, so I mean, I think I'm like a lot of creatives. I started out drawing. That's what I wanted to do. And I was happy with the idea that someone else would write stories that I would draw. But what kept happening to me was that I would tell someone, "Well, here's my idea. Here's all these, scenes and things," and then they would just go, "Just write it yourself." And so, I realized that a lot of being an illustrator is being a storyteller. It's being a narrative designer, right? You have to come up with illustrations that matter, that make people feel something, and to do that, you have to have a character and you have to have a story. And so I kind of, I fought it for a while, but that's why I started writing Hack Slash. I was just, even though Robert was like, "Well, I'm too busy to do it," I was like, "Okay, I'll just do it." And I didn't really know how to do that. I just did it. And I had writing, I had English courses in college. I didn't have any creative writing classes, but I have a journalism background. I had a journalism minor when I was in college before they switched us to our majors being all encompassing. So I understood the basic idea of writing something, and I understood the pyramid, journalism pyramid, all that sort of thing. So I kind of used parts of that and I just did it without, I don't know, just overconfidently, I guess I would say, probably. But on the other hand, I learned a ton, and then I kept getting hired to write stuff, Um, and I think something like Hack Slash, which was I didn't have to do a lot of research. I had seen all those movies. I lived in a B movie world. It was a perfect thing for me to start with. I wrote what I knew. But then after that, I kind of realized uh, I learned so much writing Hack Slash that I could probably write something else. So I started, I wrote a comic called Revival, and that was pretty well received, and that got me work writing on Batman, and got me work writing on Nightwing. And part of it was just blind, arrogant, just I can do it. I'll figure it out. And I actually recommend that about writing. I mean, I think you have an inherent sense of what a story is, right? You ever do that thing where you sitting around with your friends and you start, you know, talking about something that happened, and then you sort of go, "Oh my God, this isn't a story. It doesn't have an ending. What am I doing? I wish I would shut up." Right? Everybody's had that. Well, you know what a story is. Then you know what there's a a setup. There's a rise in action. There's a conflict, and there's a resolution. So you know what it is in your brain and in your soul. You know it. So I recommend just writing. I mean that's just write the story. Type it out, thumbnail it out, do whatever you have to do, and learn from that. I mean, I think sometimes writing is made to seem like this mystical art, you know, and it's not. It's really just sort of taking something that you want out in the world and just making it into a sequence of events that makes someone care.
Um, this is kind of my last question, but also for all of you, if you guys have any questions, think about them now as Tim answers my next question. I'm going to open up the floor to you all. Where do you see the future of comics, right? Because it's interesting, we did take this journey through the 90s, right? Like you and I are the same age essentially. And so like, watching digital like Photoshop and all this stuff come to life, and then it went from hand drawn illustration and inking, and then like now like print is interesting. Like even that, like I love going to a comic shop smelling the paper, but I don't know how much longer comic shops are going to be open. They say they're not going anywhere. Like records made a revival. I don't know if paper is like the record nowadays. Where do you
Yeah,
see the future of comic and narrative and games and all that? Like where do you see the future of all this stuff going?
I mean, a big part of it is that everything kind of converges, right? I mean that the digital platforms and games and all these sort of things are going together, and all these platforms, that's what they want to converge. It's one place where you get your stories and your games and all that, and that's been in the works forever. But I mean, stories will never go anywhere. People love stories. Humans will always love stories. That's how we connect to other people. It's how we learn empathy. It's how we entertain ourselves. So um, comics is a great way to deliver stories. It always has been. It doesn't take a lot of people. Films are extremely expensive. Animation is insanely expensive, and so comics kind of always have a place because they can be made by relatively few people. They can be made by one person, and they're a great vehicle for just pure creation, right? I mean, it's exactly what you see in your head put on paper, given to someone else. So I think that's why they remain relevant. And yeah, I mean, I've been hearing print is dead for 25 years, and I think a lot of comics have gone digital, and that's great. It's a great platform to be able to read comics on your phone. Webtoons is amazing. I know a lot of people read stuff that way. Uh, that's great. It's comics. I don't care how people read them, there's always a place for books. I think a physical object, um, especially one, it seems to me to be a better way to connect to things. It makes them less disposable, but also I think, to some degree, people want to show the things they love on their shelf. And so people may read a comic that they're like, that's kind of fun. I like it. But if there's one they really love, they might want it in print. They might want a nice edition. They might want a beautiful object of it. I think that's kind of where things are going to go. I mean, not everything will be printed. Not everything needs to be printed, but I mean, a major part of my business is the big hack slash hardcovers that we do that collect stuff I made 20 years ago. And people still buy them because they are beautiful objects, and you put them on your shelf and you can trot them out and share with people. But you can also then take the bus home and read a bunch of webtoons on your phone and have nothing to carry except your phone, which I think, all those things will just always exist. I think that's, and in different ways. I don't think they compete with each other; they feed each other.
That's well said. Yeah, I feel that way too. I always talk about things are cyclical. It's like, like it's not, things don't necessarily die. Like I said, like now I have a friend who's totally into records and he's a musician and he creates music for video games. Um, Hopefully this isn't the awkward silence. I know you teach too, so you're very familiar with the any questions question and
Oh
then
yeah, yeah.
but
On Zoom, it's the worst. Yeah.
it is. So yes, perfect. Thank you, Lay, for taking a leadership role and asking the first question. All right.
Yes, thank you. Dan. Hope you're on mute though. Here's the
Hi,
other option.
can you hear me?
There you go. Yes. Yes.
I have a question on how much of your like success, I guess, or like in the beginning, like how you got your Marvel internship and stuff was because of the classes you took and your specific education versus what you did on your own, I guess.
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't think I would have known. School gave me the education of how to put together a portfolio, right? How to, and we had a portfolio class in my college, which I'm sure you do too, which was extremely useful. I think me applying for that internship without that ability probably wouldn't have been as lucrative for me. I probably wouldn't have got the job. On the other hand, you're right. I mean, all kinds of what I did was outside of school. I mean, I was self-publishing those comics before that. So I think it's probably the answer is both. Um, I, I'll always stand by that. College education is extremely useful, and I really appreciate people who are self-starters. But there's a whole bunch of things you wouldn't know to self-start, right? You just wouldn't know it. There's no, a system for like, this is what a portfolio likes. Here's how you go like out in the world without someone who's had that experience telling you about it. So I think that it's a little bit of both, and definitely there are pages that that they looked at that were from my senior project. I did a senior project and did a 5-page story that got me that gig, but also there was stuff in there that I had done completely on my own. So I think it's useful to have as much stuff from as many sources as you can.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, good question.
Anyone else before we let Tim go? Tim, dude, you're awesome. I really appreciate it. I owe you dinner, or we'll go out for a drink or something as a thanks, man. I really appreciate this. And I guess virtual applause. I know there's a way to do it with a reaction.
There you go. I got a couple. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
Hey,
there you go. Yeah, dude.
got a good teacher here, and enjoy your day home on the Zoom.
See you later. See you, Tim.
Okay.
All right, everybody. So just briefly sum up class. Like get your AI projects in today. Email me if you have any questions. I'm in sort of meetings all day, and then I'm taking my daughter trick-or-treating tonight, so I don't know if I'll be able to answer anything. If you absolutely have computer issues or you can't get Firefly or whatever the problem is when you're working on your AI projects, reach out to me and I'll give you a little bit of a few day extension, but like you should be able to handle it and make friends with each other too to get help and support, just because it builds community. Other than that, if there's no questions for me, you guys are welcome to go.
Are there any other like websites to